Hey, everybody, it's Steve here with a special episode. This episode is a presentation that I did for a group on the history of beekeeping and a general background on beekeeping. The first part of the presentation, you might call it, is an actual history of beekeeping, and in particular, the first apiary ever found. So I'm going to walk through this presentation and probably spend a little bit more time on that history portion of the beekeeping. But also, it is kind of important to focus in particular on certain aspects of modern day beekeeping because there really is a really tight continuity between the beginning of beekeeping and the keeping of domesticated bees all the way from the earliest time when man entered the agricultural revolution to today. So we'll get into all of that. So this presentation is entitled Beekeeping Presentation History and Practice. That's a very snappy title, I might say. Our website is www.guerrabees.com. Here's a little video of an actual one of our hives. These are called they're Langstroth hives, and we'll get into a little bit more detail on that. And then we have on top of this particular hive is called a nucleated colony or a nucleus colony. And that I had just purchased that morning, that very morning that I had set that up. I set it up at about 8 a.m. I picked it up at about 4 a.m., set it there, and that is the very heart of a colony of bees. I took those bees, I put them into this box, which it you will get into a little bit more about that in a moment. And that has a queen that has every single component that a colony will need to eventually grow and thrive. A little background about me. Some of you people might know this, some of you may not. I'm Steve Guerra, host of the History of the Papacy podcast. I run my apiary with my wife, Rebecca. We established Guerra Bees in 2020 and 2022 in Hamilton, Texas. I like to call ourselves the accidental apiarists or beekeepers and I wanted to call our apiary the accidental apiary because we bought this land, and in Texas you need to do some sort of agricultural produce or something on your ranch land or farmland. And bees, oh, that bees seem pretty easy, let's go do bees. We really thought that this land would just be kind of a little bit of an investment and then maybe go there camping now and again, a hangout, but it really did turn into something much bigger. We started with 0 hives and 0 knowledge of beekeeping. Now, 3 years later, we have over 20 hives, almost 2 dozen hives at this moment, and we're still growing. This wasn't my first foray into sweet liquids, you might call them. When lived where we lived previously, I had 4 or 5 maple trees in my backyard, and I would tap them in the spring and get maple syrup out of them. That was a whole process, not quite as complicated as beekeeping by any stretch of the imagination, but we got a couple of gallons of maple syrup every year from just 4 or 5 trees in our suburban backyard. When we decided to become beekeepers, my wife and I, we just jumped all in. We took some educational courses. We watched hours of videos on YouTube because what else would you do? We read books, bought all the equipment, and then we bought 12 hives of bees in the spring of 2022. I'm a teacher by day, so this is a second gig. You might even say a third gig, but it is really fun, and it sort of takes on its own a life of its own where you want to keep growing and getting more bees and getting more bees. But we'll get into why you're almost forced to do that in just a moment. Here's a little history of Apis mellifera, the common honeybee. There's generally 3 different theories on the evolution of the honeybee, a mellifera. There's a North African kind of middle s right in the conjunction of North Africa and the Middle East of where they may have originated from, so that would be represented by lowercase I, and so generally what they think is that the honeybee spread up into the Middle East and the Levant, then 2 ways into Europe, either through Anatolia and then across North Africa into Western Europe. Then there's a theory represented by the 2, lowercase i's, placing that origin a little further east into the kind of the eastern edge of the Middle East, getting into what you might call the Trans-Caspian region, I suppose. From there, the honeybees spread throughout Africa, through the Levant and Middle East, and then hooking around into Western Africa, which I kind of like that theory the best myself, because that could also represent that some think that the honeybee may have actually originated, or at least the precursor to the honeybee may have originated way further east, maybe even into Southeast Asia. So if they work their way either naturally or were being cultivated, and they worked their way all the way to the west to generally that point and then burst out, that might represent movements of the Indo-European people, kind of depending on when that happened. Then the third theory is that honeybees started in sort of Central Africa, which you might call the Great Lakes region of Africa, and then moved north, and one branch moving into Western Europe, one branch moving up and through basically working its way up the Nile into the Middle East, Levant, and then into Eastern Europe. So take it from either way. It's probably in both cases, they would have gotten into Europe through 2 different routes, which could mean a lot, and we could get into a lot of the background of that in future episodes. Before we move on, I think it's important to discuss how honeybees actually grow and how they live or survive, you might say, and why they're domesticated of a sort. And domestication and early agriculturalist is really one of the topics I love reading. There's a great book called Against the Grain, and I might even do a couple of episodes on that, just that book, because it really does play into that agricultural revolution that happened in the Middle East, which really would eventually lead to all of the different cultures that we talk about, that would eventually lead into the Bible. But oftentimes bees will move into cavities. So this, on the left, this green thing would represent a tree and a hole inside of a tree. And what the bees will do is, in the top, they'll build out honey stores. Then they'll build out pollen stores. And then in the middle is basically the working area where the queen will lay her eggs, and then in the bottom, there will be something called queen cells, which we'll get into. And what the modern day Langstroth beehive, and all other beehives too, that people will use for r- rearing honeybees, is to try and capture that design that bees will use in these cavities: a chamber where eggs are laid, then chambers for pollen, chambers for honey, and then it's all enclosed. We'll move on to ancient beekeeping, and there's this Tel Rehov apiary from the 10th century BCE. So that's going back a long way. And this is considered possibly the very first apiary in the world, or bee yard, and possibly, and certainly the oldest recorded and documented archaeological excavation of an apiary. This area truly was the land of milk and honey. It's the first documented actual apiary for raising agricultural products. Existed in the 9th, 10th century BCE, in sort of the biblical United Kingdom of Israel time period under King Saul, David, and Solomon. So take that for what it's worth. There's a lot of different ways you could approach that as far as the historicity of that kingdom, those people. There's definitely some truth to a United Kingdom of Israel, and that probably would have been in this Tel Rehov would have fit into that complex. Tel Rehov is located in the Jordan Valley between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea in the area what would much later be called the Decapolis. It's pretty close to Bet Shean. So these are all ancient places. It may have been more into the Aram Damascus and the Syrian complex that was going on up in that uh, area of what would be the northeastern section of the modern day nation of Israel. And like I've said, it's switched hands many times in the preceding millennia. 30 clay hives were found, but the site may have had up to 200 individual hives. Now, if you put that into perspective of I'm a small, more or less amateur beekeeper, probably something more than just straight backyard beekeeper, but certainly not a commercial apiary, which might have thousands of hives. I have about 25-ish hives between it's an often fluctuating number, so you don't it's hard to say, but I have about in a little over 2 score hives. This place, which would have been a major center, had about 200 hives. The hives were cylinders made of clay, which would represent similarly to the cavities in the trees where bees naturally make their homes. They've actually found dead bees in these jars and around the site, and they've done DNA testing. And I haven't done a ton of research into this, but it is something I'm going to look a little bit closely. And experts say that the bees appear to have been imported from Anatolia. So, not too distantly far to the north, which also raises a lot of questions, but once I do a little bit more research, I think I'll be able to do a little bit more speculation or a little tighter beam speculation, you might say, on this. But it's very interesting that they weren't likely native to there. So just the first couple of questions that would come to my mind are whether these were natural honeybees that just happened to have migrated from Anatolia. Were they traded as a trade good, as a domesticated agricultural beast from Anatolia to northern Israel? That's a very interesting question. Or if this was a complex that there could have been. My guess is that this is not a one shot deal, this apiary. We're talking about clay pots that don't last very long and that fall apart pretty easily if broken. So this might have just been the black swan that archaeologists were able to find this particular place, this particular apiary. But so that begs a lot of questions. Were they looking, these Anatolian honeybees were something special? Just like today, there's certain bees that are more sought after than others. And we'll keep going back to this natural beehive of how they will build in a tree when we look at what man made beehives look like. These cylindrical hives were designed so that bees could fly into a small hole in the front, and the beekeeper could take the honey and the honeycomb out of the other side. And this setup is really ingenious, but if we look at the natural beehive, we can see that there's sort of some problems. Naturally, bees want to build upward and downward in the vertical direction, and these jars were laid down, so that makes it a little bit more challenging. The bees are going to be building up in them. So it's not necessarily that they're going to build them out. You're gonna have a mixed amount of products as they're building them horizontally. So I'm questioning whether the bees would naturally put honey into the part of the jar that you could basically pry off and then pull out the honey and the wax that you would want. Despite these issues and just these things that seem like issues to me as a modern beekeeper, they were the norm from the time from all sorts of times and places all around the ancient world, from ancient Egypt all the way up into the Roman Empire, really all over the Mediterranean world. Experts theorize that an apiary the size of the Tel Rehov apiary could make over 1,000 pounds of honey yearly. So this is really an industrialized scale of honey to meet the mass sweet needs of the people. So just in comparison, my first years, I made about one third that amount of honey with approximately 5% the hives. So 5% the hives, I made about one third the honey that the Tel Rehov apiary was expected to make. Based on the average 35 pounds per hive, 35 pounds of honey per hive in just Texas, and that varies widely across different time or different climates and from year to year, but just as an average, an apiary that size would of 200 hives today would produce over 7,000 pounds of honey pretty comfortably. So we really get a land of milk and honey. There's 61 references to honey in the Tanakh or the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And that's not even including New Testament references. There's a ton of them, in which is really its own separate episode. There's two references that really stick out, 1 Samuel 14 and Judges 14:8, that 100% refer to bee honey. And these are possibly the only two quotes that specifically refer to honey. There's some other references to honeycomb, but we're going to parse this out a little bit. So I'll read these two. So we have the first quote from 1 Samuel 14. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth and his eyes brightened. And I can tell you, anybody, if you've eaten honey straight off the comb, there's no way your eyes won't brighten. And then the second one is a kind of a weird one from Judges 14, the Samson story. Sometime later, when he went back to marry her, he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass, and in it he saw a swarm of bees and some honey. He scooped out the honey with his hands and ate it as he went along. When he rejoined his parents, he gave them some, and they ate it. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey from the lion's carcass. And that's a really, if you want, everything about Samson is weird, and this is a really weird one as well. And scholars have really torn this story apart to try and find out what the real deal is. So a little earlier in the story, Samson kills a lion, really reminiscent of Hercules, and your mind is instantly thought to, as the translation goes, to the carcass, that the bees basically built their hive inside of the dead animal, but while it's still in has flesh on it. What most scholars think is that this was a long time later and that this lion was probably picked down to the bone. If that's the case, bees would definitely build their hives on the bones, the rib bones, the rib cage of a dead animal. That's not that out of the question. Them building it inside of a rotten animal would probably be a no-go. The book of Deuteronomy has the most references to this land of milk and honey, which we will talk about right now. So why was Israel the land of milk and honey? Now, these quotes, as I said, some scholars think that these are the only two quotes that specifically refer to honey and bees. At one time, most scholars thought that most of the references were actually talking, when they refer to honey, they were referring to a syrup of mashed fruit, particularly dates, that would turn it that they could strain out and make a syrup out of, and they called that honey as well. It was the same word in Hebrew. Remember, we'll get into it with an episode with Gil. Hebrew did not have a ton of words back then to play with. So there's a lot of overlap in words that have multiple meanings for one term. And honey is one of those. Bee honey, as well as this fruit mash. But the Tel Rehov apiary changed this particular view in that scholars thought initially that honey from bees was a very rare product, and it was probably coming from just wild bees. Somebody would stumble upon a wild hive of bees and then pull out some honey comb out of there and squeeze some honey out of it. But now that we're seeing with Tel Rehov, which is a fairly recent excavation, that honey production was an agricultural product, mass agricultural product. So this milk and honey was really a metaphorical understanding from the Bronze and Iron Age Mediterranean cultures. Milk and honey were represented like everything that was good and holy in the world. M- Uh, Baby Zeus was fed a diet of milk and honey. The likely range of native honeybees population was in the Middle East. They would have had rich access to natural wild honey, and this place is one of the places in the world that had early domesticated honey production. Milk, as far as milk goes, these people were pastoralists and herders. These, especially the early Israelites, look at Genesis. They are for the most part, not sedentary farmers. They are pastoralists. Then you have the idea of milk and milk products combined with honey. I mean, who does not like cheese with the drizzle of honey? And it doesn't matter if it's a fresh treat cheese or a really super aged, salty like Parmesan. You put a little dash of honey on there and it's out of this world. Cheese, once it's made, especially once it's an aged cheese, it's highly portable and easy to preserve. Honey has basically an infinite lifespan and shelf life. So you look at these two products, this area of the central Levant, ancient Israel, was the land of milk and honey. And if we look at it on top of just beyond milk and honey, beeswax was an incredibly important and useful product. It was useful for making metal molds. And we're talking about the Bronze Age here. You want to make molds, they would form things out of beeswax and then pour the metal onto them. It's more complicated than that, and it's probably way more complicated than I would remotely understand, but you get the drift. Light from beeswax candles is very close to the light output of natural sunlight, so it's a great thing to light your house with or read by. If you have a couple of really good beeswax candles, you can 100% read by them at night without hurting your eyes, where a fire in a hearth or in any way, that is not as easy to read it, especially because you can put the light behind you with candles, you can surround yourself with them. Beeswax would eventually be used as a writing medium. You would press the wax and write into the wax with a stylus on a book called a sort of a proto book, a wooden frame with beeswax laid out, melted onto it and flattened. This was called a diptych, and sometimes they would even put several of these diptychs together into sort of a ancient version of a notebook. And with this stylus, you could even press out the wax and for lack of a better word, erase what you have written on the wax tablet. Or if it was the wax got completely gunked up, you just melt it off, just leave it in the sun and in the hot Mediterranean sun, and it'll melt enough to just scrape it all off. And then you just flatten it back out and you're back in the writing game. One other thing that I didn't even put in this presentation is that beeswax is an excellent water repellent. You can melt the wax and then start to rub it into something like leather, and that leather or whatever or rub it into wood. that product becomes essentially waterproof, and it's really hard to get that even out with repeated rain and even washing. It's a very durable once it's impregnated into a product. Beeswax all and honey also have antibacterial properties as well. So let's move on to a little bit about how bees we'll get into a little bit about how bees work, honeybees work as an animal or as an agricultural beast of burden. And that will help us understand the history we've discussed before and a little bit of the more modern history of honeybees. And like I said, I want to do more episodes where I fill in some specifics because there's some fascinating topics on bee history, especially in medieval Christian history, but we'll get into those in a different day. So there's the three types. There's workers, drones, and queens. Workers are the largest numbers by volume in the hive, and they're all females. Each worker bee goes through a cycle of jobs in the hive from when they're born to when they die. So they might take care of the queen, do nursery duty where they're taking care of and feeding and cleaning baby bees, guarding the hive, cleaning the hive, processing honey and pollen, gathering honey and pollen and more. One female worker will cycle through all of these jobs in approximately a 1.5 month lifespan. Then you have drones. They're males with one job, and they make up about 20, 15 to 10 to 15% of a healthy hive or colony. They live about 2 months maximum, and really their only job is to impregnate queens. They go out into drone swarms. They'll go hang out in trees or under mailboxes or different places. And with drones from other beehives and colonies, and all they do is mate, and a queen will just mate, 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 and fly back to the hive, which this all helps with genetic diversity and variation between colonies. A queen is not necessarily getting impregnated with the genetic information of just drones from her hive. She's getting impregnated with from drones from hives, could be 20, 30, hundreds of hives all across a region. So they're that are could be very different genetically made up. Also, the one other kind of downside to all that is that these drone swarms can often pass on viruses and disease and pests because drones are mixing with drones from other hives. So these drones could fly back to their hive in the evening to go eat and fuel up for tomorrow's big drone hangout. And they've spread these viruses far and wide and in a very short amount of time. And then you have queens, which is a female with one job, but it is one big job. The queen's one job is to lay eggs, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of eggs. Once a queen's hatched, they must go on that mating flight with the drones. And it's pretty much there's only one or two times that a queen will leave her hive except during something called swarming. And queens can live up to 5 years, but because they become less and less effective in laying eggs as they get older, generally apiaries, especially commercial apiaries, will replace a queen either once a year or every 2 years. Here's the life cycle of a honeybee from egg to an adult. So it follows pretty much the standard insect life cycle of egg, larva, pupa, adult. Every insect's slightly different, but they're also going to go through three, these main four stages. So a worker goes from egg. So generally, they're all workers, drones, and queens. They go through a similar cycle, and it's about the same amount of time. So workers take about 21 days to develop, drones a little bit longer, and queens, believe it or not, a little bit less. And I haven't seen a good reason why queens are about a week to 2 weeks less development time. My thought is that they get so the difference what really differentiates between each of the drone and worker versus queen is the queens will get a super, super high octane rich diet, which may increase in the speed and rate of development because the queen, once they need a queen to start moving fast. And the queen, it takes time for her to do her flights to go get impregnated. And there's a lot of danger in that setup because she can go out into the world and get eaten by another insect or trapped by a spider, eaten by a bird or anything like that, or fly swatted, hit by your car. There's a million and one things. So they do have to, if they don't have a queen or they want to swarm, they need to move on this queen cell fast. So beekeeping today, the most common hive equipment is called the Langstroth hive, and it's based on the design of a reverend. I believe he was a Methodist in my reading, but don't quote me on that. And I want to do a little bit more of a deep dive on the Reverend Lorenzo Langstroth, because he is a fascinating character. He was a native of Philadelphia and a graduate of Yale Divinity School. He lived through the middle of the 1800s, and he's known as the father of American beekeeping. And he actually worked close with the Dadant brothers. More commonly, you'll hear them called Dadant, and Dadant is one of the biggest beekeeping supply companies in the country, possibly the world. And those guys, the guy who found it was a French guy named Dadant. He worked with Lorenzo Langstroth during this 1800s time period. So the Reverend Langstroth was an insect fanatic. He seemed like he was way more fanatical about insects than maybe his religious life, but that's maybe up for debate, and we can talk about that later. He was really key in determining the amount of space where a honeybee will build out comb. And he really approached this in a scientific and an engineering way, and how a bee builds their hives and how they build the comb where they're going to put their resources into and how much space they need for that. Based on that, then you can build this modular system that a beekeeper can build and take away from their hive in order to better manage the bees. If you just look at the picture, especially that bottom part, that bottom box that has those and that cutout, those are all frames. And those frames, the bees will build out their comb on there, and they're constricted enough where they can build out the comb, the honeycomb, but it can't get too big, and they can't build double comb in between those frames. It forces them to build out comb onto the next frame instead of just because these bees will fill up every nook and cranny with comb. You want to limit that because that comb is superfluous and it's going to have to be scraped. It could invite disease and pests into it. It also can separate, because one of the big things with bees is, and with harvesting bee products is, sure, a bear might be super happy to put his hand into, or claw or paw or whatever they call it on a bear, dip it into a beehive and eat the comb. That bear is going to be more than happy to get calories from the wax, from the honey, and also the baby bees and the eggs in the brood chamber. We don't want that. I think most people would be fairly disgusted to have mushy bee larvae in with their morning honey, even though it is highly protein dense. And I'm imagining animals like that better than they like the honey, but that's a different story. But you get the drift. It keeps it separated so that honey is just pure liquid gold up in those higher boxes, which are called honey supers. So this is a picture of our Langstroth hives, and that's a picture of me working our Langstroth hives. This is a good time to talk about the daily life of a beekeeper, and it'd be very similar for that ancient beekeeper working the Rehov bee yard way back, going on 3,000 years ago. It really depends on what the day to day for a beekeeper. today, and I guarantee it way back then, is the cycles of the year. Spring is really the busy season, by which I mean the bees begin to emerge out of a type of hibernation called clustering. Those bees will form a ball about the size of a grapefruit, more or less, depending on how many bees are in the hive. But it's all about them beating their little wings. All of them beating their little wings creates friction heat, which will keep the queen, who's right smack dab in the middle of that ball of bees, at 95 degrees. But in spring, they're starting to get out of there. So when it gets over 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which Celsius, more or less, it's 50, they'll say 50 degrees. What it is it's not too warm outside, or really, it's more important that it's not too cold, kind of like light jacket weather. Anything light jacket weather and below, the bees are going to stay in cluster as it starts to warm up in the spring. So in Central Texas, where we are, that change from wearing maybe two layers, 3 layers of, and it's chilly, into light jacket weather starting to happen at the end of March. In a place like, in the northern latitude, say you're in Scotland or the northern part of the United States, southern Canada, that might not start happening, that weather, until May. Your spring is going to vary, and what you gotta do and when you have to do it is going to vary greatly as well. But when they start to break cluster right out of the gate, they start to build new comb and clean out the hive. So they're cleaning out dead bees, dead bee parts, uh, bee droppings, which they make a lot of droppings. Then the wildflowers and the other flora, they begin to explode in spring. And the bees colonies, once they start gathering in pollen and nectar, they just start to grow massively. Larger colonies will, what we call, swarm. They'll raise a new queen, and once that queen has been mated, she will just go and take half of the hive numbers of bees and go form up her own new situation, her own new queendom in someplace else. Obviously, and ideally, if you're a beekeeper, you want to prevent that before it happens so that you can take that new queen and the half that are going to dip out and go start a new colony for your bee yard. With that would be called a split, taking one big bee colony and splitting it into two smaller bee colonies that will hopefully grow up to be two healthy, heavy colonies. The bees work hard all spring and into early summer collecting nectar and making honey. Worker bees, called foragers, go out and collect nectar and pollen and water, and they come back. They pass the nectar on to worker bees. A succession of worker bees pass the nectar back and forth from mouth to mouth and into a special chamber in their stomach, and they kind of spit it back and forth, mixing enzymes with this nectar, and eventually that will turn into honey. But they'll deposit that honey into a cell. A certain amount of concentration has happened as they spit it back and forth. Then once they put it into a cell, the natural air draft in the hive will start to dry out the honey in the individual cells, along with the bees beating their wings to dehumidify the honey, all the way down to about only 18% water after you're all said and done, or after they're all said and done. And once they feel, the bees feel that it's the right concentration of sugar to water, they'll put a wax cap over the top of that honey, and they're saving that. Evolutionarily, they're saving that for next winter, or to get them through rough times in the year, or they're using it to directly feed their babies, depending on where the honey is in the hive. And we may get into that later if that's a question you have, but that's what they're using that honey for. It's to either feed themselves, feed the babies as they're growing, or it's saving it for later, for tough times ahead. That leads to extraction time, and that's the pictures on this if you're watching it on YouTube or on Patreon. Right when the summer, especially here in Central Texas, and I know different parts of the country experience this to similar and lesser degrees, but there's almost always a time during the summer where it gets hot and really nothing's growing. It's a long time in Central Texas, really after about middle of July up until September. It's a time period called the dearth where there's really nothing for the bees to forage on. And this is a rougher time of the year, believe it or not, for the honeybees than winter is in Central Texas. In Central Texas, that's when we take the honey is right before they're going into this dearth period. We take all that honey they work so hard to collect. What we do is we start feeding them a solution of simple syrup, a 1-to-1 sugar to water syrup, and that's what they're going to use to survive through the dearth until they can start bringing in some natural resources and start to stock away this sugar water that we've been feeding them. The fall is really the building up of their stores for winter. So, as beekeepers, we're watching very closely that they're in the good process of building up stores so that when our winter, I use air quotes for winter because some people might laugh at winter, but as far as honeybees are concerned, it's winter when it's getting below that threshold of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the chilliness out. Bees, by the time the real cold kicks in, they're hunkering down into their cluster, and it really doesn't matter if it's 50 degrees Fahrenheit or it's -10 Fahrenheit or even below. They will stay in that cluster and they will keep that queen warm the whole time, no matter how cold it is. Most of my hives have survived 0 degree Fahrenheit. So you're talking -10, -12, even more degrees Celsius. I think there was a couple of days that it did get into even the minus single digits Fahrenheit, which is pretty cold. And my bees, I lost one colony, and it could have been from the cold. It could have been that they ran out of resources to eat, or they couldn't access it. It got too cold. There wasn't the numbers. They ate their through their feed, or they lost that critical mass of bees that they needed to keep cluster, and they just froze out. There's a lot of reasons why bees will not make it through the winter, but you get the drift that they can go through some very cold temperatures. And I would say the weather conditions and the climate of Central Texas is very similar in a lot of ways of to what they would have had in something like the Tel Rehov apiary situation. Maybe Tel Rehov wouldn't have had the extremes in temperature that a place like Central Texas would have, but dryness, heat, that sort of thing. Look on this slide. This is a picture of my son and I, and a friend of mine and my wife extracting the honey just this past spring. There's a lot of different processes to it, but it's really, once you have the equipment, it's not that difficult. It's just a lot of steps to making sure that the honey stays clean and pure. Then after that, we bottle it and we sell it and eat it. Eat a lot of, probably more than we sell even, because it is that good. We really do hear so much about colony collapse disorder. The honeybees are dying out, and in some ways that's very much true. In some ways that's maybe overblown. Maybe overblown's not quite the word, but honeybees, we want to be so careful about how they're managed because they are the number one pollinator of our food, and they pollinate a gigantic percentage of the food that we eat today. That you go to your grocery store, and it just doesn't have to be in the produce section. All throughout that grocery store is food that's been pollinated by pollinators, and they were probably pollinated by honeybees. And that's why we're starting to see the conversation switch to, well, honeybees are pushing out native pollinators. That's probably not true, and that's maybe what's true about if there is some truth to that, it is overblown in the extreme. We need honeybees because they are such powerful and prolific pollinators. In the United States, one thing that people don't know about is California. You think of California, and what's the big business of California? The tech industry in Silicon Valley or the movie industry of Hollywood, and those are massive industries. But w possibly a bigger industry in California, and I haven't looked at the raw numbers, but I'm sure it's very close to par with any of these industries, is agriculture, particularly nuts. Almonds and pistachios and other nuts are grown in California, and this is a fairly recent innovation. These nuts originally, if you were to buy something like pistachios or almonds, probably not too long ago, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, were likely grown in a place in the Middle East somewhere or in the Caucasus region. Now, over 77% of all almonds consumed in the world come from California, and they are pollinated. They must be pollinated by honeybees. So you think about just one industry that is completely dependent on honeybees. Native pollinators aren't going to do that. There just isn't enough of them. You can't have agriculture without technology and using your animals and the land and the forest and fauna and stewardship appropriately. So what are the dangers to honeybees right now? And one of the big one is something called the Varroa destructor mite. These are the things that are in large part causing colony collapse. They're a little tiny mite, and you can see what they look like on a honeybee, and they basically drain the fluids out of the honeybee. They deform their body. A bee might have 3 or 4 of these little mites attached to them, and they slowly kill the bee, and as more and more bees get them, more and more of them die, and the hive just can't function anymore, and so either they'll leave that hive or they'll just all die, in which once there isn't enough bees to do the functions of the hive, it's ripe to be taken over by either other insects just waiting in the wings, like the small hive beetle, or different kinds of wasps, something called a wax moth. They're just waiting to get in there and eat that larva and eat the honey, eat all this stuff that the bees have worked so hard to produce. Other things I have mentioned, other pests like small hive beetles, and it really depends on the area, what kind of pest is the worst. Europe has had a really big problem with something called the murder hornet, or the Asian murder hornet, you may have called it. That's a really bad pest. They're not a huge problem in the US yet, but they may be a problem. And we should really thank our brother and sister beekeepers in Europe because they've done a lot to learn how to manage that hornet. So hopefully it's not as devastating if and when it does reach the United States in numbers. You can do something to help support bees and pollination, and that is support a hive. You can sponsor a Guerra Bee hive if you go to our website, www.guerrabees.com, or send me an email to steve at a2zhistorypage.com. I can give you more information about sponsoring a hive. If you want to support a hive and support apiaries and pollinators, that is a great way to do it. And there's benefits to you as well beyond being able to eat and get things in your grocery store. So I hope you enjoyed this little tour into the history of beekeeping. Uh, Ancient history all the way up to modern history. There will be more of this to come because it's a topic I'm quite fascinated with. I've always said this, that whenever I dive into learning something new, even if it's just a practical thing, I have to change a hose or something in my sink, I wind up doing the history of pea traps on my way to learning how to do that little job, and I've definitely done that with beekeeping, and I've been diving in even more. So if you like this, definitely reach out and let me know. If you want to sponsor a hive, let me know about that too. I really appreciate you listening, and I will talk to you next time.